My name is Dr. Nick Winges-Llanas. My pronouns are she and her, and we are going to be presenting Crip Conversations with a very special guest, Lydia Xc Brown. This presentation is in partnership with the Steve Hicks School of Social Work and the Texas Center for Disability Studies. I am doing a visual description of myself for accessibility. Please know that we also have ASL available as well as closed captioning. So you just click on the closed captioning link at the bottom of the screen if you would like to have that pop up. And I would remind all of our guests to speak at a moderate pace so that our interpreters can keep up with us. And I remind myself because I tend to speak quite quickly when I am nervous. So I am a white woman with blue rimmed glasses and pinkish blonde bobbed hair, and a pink shirt with Bella Lugosi all over it and a green velvet bow tie with books in the background and a super cool headset that makes me look like I should be on an airfield. And we are going to be talking today with an amazing guest that I'm just so excited about, Lydia Xc Brown, who is an advocate, organizer, attorney, strategist, and writer whose work focuses on interpersonal and state violence against disabled people at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, faith, language, and nation. They are adjunct lecturer and core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program and adjunct professorial lecturer in American University's Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies. Lydia founded the Fund for Community Reparations for Autistic People of Color's Interdependence, Survival, and Empowerment, co-edited All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism, and is creating, which I just remembered and I was super excited about and reminded my wife about, a Disability Justice Wisdom Tarot card deck. Often their most important work has no title, job description, or funding, and probably never will. So today we are going to be talking about the global COVID-19 pandemic, which is an individually and collectively re-traumatizing experience with devastating effects on already hyper-marginalized and targeted communities. For generations, we've struggled against the catastrophic impacts of environmental racism, settler colonialism and imperialism, capitalism, and white supremacy, all intricately intertwined with ableism. Sick, mad, disabled, and neurodivergent people at the margins of the margins and negatively racialized, impoverished, queer and trans and other minoritized communities have always already worked to create and sustain collective and community care practices just to stay alive. This talk will explore and discuss possibilities for survival, sustainability, and care during COVID-19, rooted in disability justice, politic, philosophy, and praxis. So I want to welcome Lydia here and first ask, how are you doing today at this time in this space right now, Lydia?
This is Lydia. I am exhausted, stressed out, and pretty much done, just like basically everybody else that I talked to. Also, there's been a question among the panelist side that the captioning permission needs to be reassigned. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment and let the person responsible reassign those permissions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia.
Oh, it's been done. Okay,
Okay.
great. Just wanted to make sure that that happened.
Yes, it has. Oh, I think Lydia has frozen.
Oh, I'm
There you go.
here.
Oh,
It's
there you go. Okay, okay.
not frozen. But I am autistic, so sometimes my face goes blank looking, and then it looks like I froze it.
Thank you. Oops.
So thank you so much for that introduction as well. Again, my name is Lydia. Sign name is L. Brown. And I'm a young East Asian person with short black hair. I'm wearing a teal and blue shirt and an open buttoned flannel shirt over that, same colors. I'm in front of two windows in a room that have blinds on them, and there's a plant that is currently alive and hopefully stays that way, which remains to be seen because I am not exactly known for my horticultural or botanical talents, in which I am mostly lacking. And I have some slides to share, if that's all right, in just a few moments. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that that's fine. I want to ask the folks who are here, the ones who are participating in the chat, if you would spend just a moment and write in the words about what you're feeling, what you're thinking right now. Where do you find yourself today? What words most encapsulate what you've carried with you into the beginning of 2021? And I'll give you a few moments to do that. If you're participating on the phone, I don't have a way currently to ask you to participate directly, but I'd ask you to reflect on that question too. I will share the responses that are coming in the chat. One person says overwhelm. Another says ableist society, exhaustion and hope, overwhelmed but trying to stay hopeful, struggling, exhaustion and grief, exhausted, tired, but relieved to hear me speak. Well, I hope that I don't disappoint you. Irritated, fatigued, anxious, lonely, busy, hopeful, frustrated, determination to be financially ready for family, depressed, empty, bewildered, confusion and low-level continued anxiety, but more hopeful than in the recent past, stressed and without motivation, but hoping this year to be able to relax again. I ask this because I begin my presentations, my workshops with an invitation and an invocation. And that invitation is the same, regardless of where I am. It's a request to you to tune in, to ground yourself, to meet yourself where you are at, to listen to your body mind, to what it is that your body mind needs for you to know and to understand, to learn what your body mind needs, craves, desires, to listen and tune in to oneself, to the space we are in, to the body minds that we inhabit, to ask ourselves what it is we have carried with us into this space. Many of you have offered some answers, some thoughts to that. I ask us to dig deeper. Have we carried into this space our anxieties, our frustrations, our bone-deep exhaustion and weariness, our rage, our refusal to give up, to go quietly, our denials, our doubts, our spirals from the middle of the night? Have we carried with us grief, mourning, or sorrow? Have we carried with us an eager anticipation and excitement, joy, satisfaction, gratitude? Have you checked in with yourself about what you need in this moment? Are you in a place right now where your body mind feels as comfortable and as cared for and supported as it can? Would you prefer for our time together to be on a couch, in a bed, on the floor? If you are currently in a climate where it's habitable to be outside as opposed to inside? Would you prefer to have your companions, your kitties, your doggos, other critters with you now? Do you have access to food, something to eat, something to drink? If you haven't in the last couple of hours, this is an invitation to you to get that drink, to get that thing to eat. It's a webinar. We literally won't see you. It's a reminder that you can do what you need to do to take care of your body, mind. And it is also an affirmation and a reminder that for those of us who are here now, who do not have access to the support, the resources necessary, the space, the safety to be able to access or receive what we need, that is not a reflection on your worth or your value. But it is a reminder that you deserve so much more and so much better. You deserve everything. And for those of us who do have access to resources to support, to be able to access what we need, this is a reminder that you deserve to access that it is not wrong, and that you should not feel guilty for receiving the things that you need. This is a reminder that all of our body minds have needs, and those needs deserve to be met. The image that appears on this screen shows silhouettes of people with different body shapes and sizes. Some of them have mobility equipment, some do not. They're moving, sitting, or lying in different ways. My favorite one is the one that's on the left-hand side. This person is lying completely horizontally on the floor. That person basically represents how I felt for the last couple of years, and possibly how many of you have felt for a while as well. This is an invitation for us to use our own space to inhabit our bodies in the ways that we need, in the ways that make sense, to be able to be in relationship with our body minds in a more caring way, to witness what we need, to hold ourselves with love, with attention. I'll give you a few moments. I make this invitation every time, just to do this grounding with me, to listen to your body mind. Sometimes people like to close their eyes for this. You can, you don't have to, that's totally up to you. But let's take that moment of grounding together now. Thank you for doing that with me. I give that invitation in every space. I've done it in spaces where I was asked to speak to 3 people, 4 people. And no, I did not just talk at 3 or 4 people. That would be very awkward and nobody would have enjoyed it. But I gave the invitation. Also, in spaces where I've spoken to groups of hundreds and thousands of people, like Fun Tangent, Not So Fun Tangent, the time that I was asked to speak on disability justice at a rally for queer liberation, at which I was misgendered on stage as I was being introduced, because that makes perfect sense as to the exact right place to misgender somebody. That was sarcasm. My other note before we continue with today's conversation is that we will be talking about issues of violence on multiple levels, historically and presently. The image that appears on this screen is a silhouette of a person in a ponytail yelling into a bullhorn up at the words for content warning. I will not be showing or playing any graphic videos that depict acts of violence. There will be no images that depict graphic acts of violence. I won't be providing any graphic detailed descriptions of any forms of violence, but I will be speaking about and naming many forms of violence with non-graphic details. So if at any time during our time together you need to take a break, to withdraw, to reground, to decompress, to recenter, then you are welcome to do that and then to return when you feel the capacity to do so. And during our time together, if you find at a certain point that you no longer have the capacity to participate or to engage, then you are also welcome to withdraw from this space. And I will not necessarily assume that that means that you hate me, except as I tell everybody, I do have pretty intense social anxiety and rejection sensitive dysphoria. So that part of my brain will assume that everybody hates me, but that's not unique to people needing to leave because of re-traumatization or feelings of emotional activation. That is pretty much a general constant that my brain is convinced that basically everybody on the planet harbors deep-seated resentment of or open hatred toward me. But we can tell my social anxiety to shut up and sit in a corner and think about what it's done because it's bad and wrong and nobody wants to listen to that. We are not going to listen to that. I want to begin our time together by talking about where I find myself in January 2021. In January 2021, I find myself back in the new year at work up to full speed. In the first couple of weeks of the year, in my full-time day job, we needed to prepare several presentations that we were asked for relatively close to when we were asked to provide those presentations, to draft multiple documents on time-sensitive deadlines, to participate in important and high-priority meetings, again, with moving very quickly because we had just come back from the end of the year vacation. I began the semester teaching more than one class, with different dates for the actual start date of class, with an expectation based on the number of emails that I've received from an assortment of provosts and deans and administrative support offices and development offices that faculty everywhere need to be prepared to learn and to integrate new modalities for virtual instruction, for student assessment, to be participating in professional development workshops, orientation workshops, meetings to get to know one another, advising, send emails ahead of time to meet and greet students, and a whole host of other expectations. I entered the new year in a situation of personal precarity. My partner has been unemployed for many months, has been job searching for a very long time at this point, and the two of us had spent the last several months wondering if, particularly due to the effects of ableism, what that would mean for us, when a job would come. In the capitalist hellhole that we live in, not having a job can mean, at a certain point, ruin, despair, or death. Where that point is depends in large part upon what accumulation of privilege, power, and access to resources a particular person has, and what experiences of marginalization, oppression, deprivation, and denial of access to resources that person is subjected to instead. By all accounts, we were more privileged and more marginalized than many people we knew at the same time. Won't leave you hanging. My partner did literally just a few days ago receive and accept a job offer, which of course is welcome news, but we didn't know that at the beginning of this year, if or when that would come, or if it did come, what form it would take. We entered the new year hoping that in the best case scenario, 2021 would at least not be as completely exhausting and devastating as 2020. And within less than a week into the new year, we bore witness to an attempted white supremacist fascist coup and insurrection. One that for me brought up additional layers of recent trauma from an experience last month. A terribly threatening and epistemically violent experience with armed Nazis. It's not a wonderful experience. Not something I wanted to carry with me into 2021. My story does not represent everyone that I know. It does not represent each of you. But we are all facing the relentless and unforgiving demands and expectations of racist, ableist capitalism. The demands and expectations to perform, to produce, to achieve. To shut down, ignore, erase, or deny layers of individual, interpersonal, societal, collective, intergenerational, and historical trauma. To somehow act as though we can be removed from constant onslaught of violence, of death. That 440,000 people is a statistic, but a statistic that represents our country's catastrophic failures of policy, of infrastructure, and of values. We are expected to continue to perform intelligence, excellence, productivity, to be and to be perceived as contributing members of society, of a neighborhood, of a community, of an activist space, of an academic community. That if we do not do these things, then we will somehow lose our tenuous claim to personhood, even when the very concept of personhood has been denied outright to those of us at the margins of the margins. Many people, especially outside of disability, would like to believe that we have long since moved past the era of eugenics. Within disability communities, we know that that is crass naivete at best, and that eugenics never died, but remains alive and well. We see this most clearly in racialized and ableist crises made stark by the pandemic. That those most at risk for death, dying, severe, lifelong disability caused by surviving COVID-19 are those who have always been deliberately targeted and marginalized the most. Workers, Black, Brown, and Native people, immigrants, those who are most disproportionately likely to be working in public-facing jobs in sanitation, in direct healthcare and support, in restaurant work, in delivery work, in frontlines work. That disabled people, particularly those who are impoverished, who are queer or trans and estranged from communities and families of origin, who are isolated even before quarantine began, those who do not have a choice but to provide childcare or elder care, extended family relations and care, while also working 1, 2, 3, or 4 jobs outside the home. Those who do not have a choice but to keep working until the only other option is a complete and total collapse. That due to centuries of explicit racist and ableist medical discrimination, of denial of life-saving treatment and care, that due to the medical carceral complex that traps, contains, and locks away people at the margins of the margins, that those who live in institutions and carceral settings of all kinds face the highest rates of transmission and contagion of COVID-19 and are the least likely to be seen as worth saving or protecting, and that those who are trapped in such institutions are disproportionately and overwhelmingly Black and Brown and disabled people in all levels of society. We see systemically and structurally what we already knew, laid bare for those who had the privilege, the ability not to have to notice, not to have to think about it. The image that's on this screen shows a textbook clipping. I share this with a lot of people because I find it useful and an important and sobering reminder. This is a diagram that shows a staircase. At each level of the staircase, there's a human figure, someone who is thin, with apparently straight hair and possibly racialized as white. The title of the diagram is Steps in Mental Development, Where They Stumble, the Limit of Development of Each Type. The figures are labeled in ascending order as idiot, low, medium, and high-grade imbecile, and moron. Each is further described by the type of work they are believed capable of performing, beginning from the bottom with mere self-preservation and continuing with simple menial work, simple manual work, complex manual work, and work requiring, as implied, at least some reason and judgment. The figures are drawn to exaggerate the appearance of stereotypes of intellectual disability. Their shoulders are slumped, their posture is stooped. They are leaning against the sides of the staircase. They are looking down or away from the viewer. They are unable to support their own weight. They appear to be standing in semi-uncomfortable positions. They have limp wrists. The image is meant to demonstrate the levels of what has often historically been called feeble-mindedness or mental defectiveness. This way of classifying human beings was a fixture of the 20th century. These particular terms are not in everyday usage as medical diagnostic terms anymore, but rather as everyday insults instead. A quick way to insult somebody is to use one of these labels instead. As recently as the 1990s, some people with intellectual disabilities were also labeled as mental retardates as a noun, R-E-T-A-R-D-A-T-E-S. I can type that into the chat in a minute. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled in the decision Buck v. Bell concerning a test case of a white woman, Carrie Buck, who was labeled feeble-minded, whose mother was labeled feeble-minded, and whose child conceived in rape was also labeled feeble-minded, that her forcible sterilization was not only not a violation of her individual rights, but in fact, her sterilization was in the public interest and for the greater good. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice, acting Chief Justice, I believe, Oliver Wendell Holmes, wrote, and I quote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That those who were, quote, manifestly unfit, unquote, ought not to reproduce. Following the 1927 decision and the rise and spread of societies for public hygiene, a precursor to modern day public health work, which, like many of our fields, has roots in profoundly racist ideologies, the United States documented over 70,000 eugenic sterilizations between 1927 and 1979. Those sterilizations were largely carried out for one of 3 reasons: criminality, sexual deviance, and mental defectiveness. These 3 categories were meant to elide clear distinctions because they functionally meant the same thing. People who pose a threat to the social order, people who are socially undesirable, people who ought not to reproduce, or people whose kind ought not to be allowed to be reproduced. Eugenic sterilization did not end in 1979. As recently as 2013, advocates in California documented sterilizations largely of Latina women in California's prisons. And this past fall, it came to light nationally that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency has been sterilizing incarcerated immigrants, largely Black, Brown, and Native people from Central and South American nations. Sterilizations also take place in less obviously forced ways, but no less violent and no less coercive. In many states, when a trans person wishes to access gender-confirming medical transitions, that person is required to undergo sterilization as a precondition for accessing medical transition care. In many group homes and institutions where people with disabilities live, a disabled person may still be subjected to sterilization if they are under guardianship and the guardian believes that it is in that person's best interest. A few years ago, a news story appeared highlighting what is probably a much more widespread phenomenon, but less formal, less institutionalized, and less documented, where people incarcerated in a particular prison system were offered additional time off their sentences for good behavior and the possibility of earlier release if they chose to undergo sterilization procedures. On paper, technically a voluntary, air quotes, procedure, because you could say no and not undergo the sterilization, but obviously if you said no, then you would not be considered for the same possibility of early release or time off for good behavior, thereby creating a horrific incentive to choose to undergo a permanent procedure. Experiences of eugenic sterilization spiral out beyond the simple and specific medical procedures of sterilization as well, to what many advocates have documented as widespread and pervasive discrimination against disabled people who are parenting children or who have children. I remember even just a few years ago, someone who I only know as an acquaintance calling me in the middle of the night to tell me I am in the hospital, I just gave birth, and Child Protective Services is here taking custody of my baby because I have a disability. Please help. The legacies of eugenics are deep and wide. And we, disabled people, often at the margins of the margins, are always left to be in constant crisis and constant crisis management. I don't know of a time when neither I nor anyone in my communities is experiencing crisis in some form or another, that we are not experiencing crisis in some form or another. I can't imagine it. I don't know what that feels like, to not be worried about at least dozens of people at a time, to not be wondering who is the next to be institutionalized, to be arrested, to lose healthcare, to be evicted, to be cut off from food stamps or Medicaid, to have another doctor kick them out of their practice, to have a partner leave, or to become aware of a partner or another caregiver's abuse and decide that they would like to leave, but not know how. I don't know of a time when we are not in crisis. And one of the legacies of eugenics that is alive and well and thriving today is a belief that we all internalize, that we deserve what we experience. That if something happens to us, if our children are taken away, if someone disrupts an intimate relationship that we initiate, if we lose access to housing or food or a job, then we did something to cause that. We contributed in some way. We are at fault somehow. These are pernicious lies of ableism. Eugenics snakes out to affect individual people's lives, not just as statistics. Michael Hickson was a Black disabled man who died last summer because a Texas hospital murdered him when he went to the hospital to seek treatment for COVID-19 and was denied care because he is disabled, because he is Black. Because for disabled people at the margins of the margins, ableism teaches us that our lives are not worth living, and therefore our lives are not worth saving. The legacies of eugenics are alive and well and thriving, down to our own expectations that we internalize deeply, even if we work very hard not to apply or to transfer or to impute them onto other people. That our own individual worth is based upon our work, our performance, our productivity, our contributions, or our intelligence. This diagram shows us just how deep the mythology of intelligence runs, how wide it is. Intelligence as a concept was invented along with the concepts of feeble-mindedness, of mental defectiveness, as a means of scientifically encoding racism, misogyny, anti-immigrant hate, as a way of encoding and justifying subtler logics, white supremacy, empire. Because if intelligence exists and can be measured and assessed and evaluated, then those who have the most privilege, those who occupy positionalities of power, of normativity, must have intelligence by definition. And those who deviate from, who disrupt, who destabilize those categories of normativity, of humanity, of health, of wellness, of whiteness, must by definition lack intelligence. And that lack must also be measurable, must be determinable. I turn here to a few starting points, a few notes for understanding and thinking through ableism. And I provide this as a way for us to ground all of our conversations, all of our teaching, all of our learning. The slide has a definition for ableism, and we will go through it piece by piece. In its most basic form, ableism is a system of thinking and doing that harms disabled people or people with disabilities. In its most basic way of being understood. And I use both of those sets of terminology intentionally. There's a side note, there's a tangent there to be had. Ableism is an entire system of thinking and doing that harms disabled people or people with disabilities. At its core, ableism is a form of systemic, structural, and institutional oppression. What that means is that ableism is a system of power differentials and power relations, wherein those whose body minds are construed as healthy, whole, functional, sane, stable, coherent, strong, and intelligent are granted, take, and have enormous political, social, cultural, and economic power at the direct expense of those whose body minds are instead construed as sick, broken, defective, disordered, deficient, weak, unstable, incoherent, crazy, insane, or dumb. Ableism is a value system that grants power, recognition, validity, and personhood to those whose body minds are understood and construed as not just norm or normative, but also as ideal, as aspirational. Ableism teaches us who ought to be allowed to live, to exist, to breathe, to be, to literally take up space. Ableism teaches us whose body minds are valuable, worthy, and desirable, and at the same time, whose body minds are expendable, disposable, acceptable collateral damage. Ableism teaches us what kinds of people ought to be allowed to have children and what kinds of children ought to be allowed to be born. Ableism at its core is profoundly racist and white supremacist, intimately, intricately wrapped up with subtler logics, with logics and discourses and mechanisms of expanding and sustaining empire, of exercising racist ideologies. Ableism and racism operate in tandem. Under global white supremacy, both abledness and disabledness are always defined as against whiteness. Because under ableist white supremacy, whiteness and abledness become co-constitutive. Whiteness is defined as health, strength, sanity, and intelligence, which means that when white people are disabled, their disabilities disrupt their ability to become intelligible and recognizable within the institution of whiteness. That global white supremacy teaches white disabled people that in order to be able to truly and fully benefit from whiteness, they must overcome, hide, or mask their disabilities. Global white supremacy makes disability both hypervisible and renders it invisible in white disabled people. It renders this disability invisible when that disability might somehow mean extreme and unacceptable lack or burden. Because disability in white disabled people becomes hypervisible when disability means deserving of access to support, care, accommodation, access, or legal recognition, or charity. And at the same time, under global white supremacist logics, disability becomes both hypervisible and rendered deliberately invisible in negatively racialized people, in Black, Brown, Native, Asian, and mixed race communities of color. Disability is rendered hypervisible when disability is the same, interchangeable, with sexual promiscuity or deviance, with criminality, with inferiority, with evidence of and confirmation of our supposed imputed physical and intellectual inferiority as against white people. And disability also is rendered deliberately invisible when disability would have otherwise meant deserving of access to care, to support, to accommodations, to access, to legal recognition. Disability and ability are always recognized or failed to be recognized based upon proximity to whiteness or distance from whiteness. Ableism in this country, in the United States of America, is particularly and perniciously anti-Black and anti-Native. According to Heard, helping educate to advance the rights of deaf communities, somewhere between 50 to as many as 80% of all people who are killed by police are disabled, meaning, as Talila Lewis describes it, Talila, Lewis, Lewis, that the intersection of race and disability is the most dangerous intersection that history has ever created. The same organization estimates that as many as 80% of all people who are incarcerated are also disabled. We know that all mechanisms of carcerality, whether in education, in medicine, or in the criminal legal system, most target those who live at the intersections of negative racialization, of ableism, of gender-based oppression, of impoverishment and class oppression. Ableism, this history can trace its way even to the earliest settler logic that imbues and undergirds modern empire today. That white Western European civilizations from the global north are somehow civilizationally superior intellectually, physically, technologically, in terms of governance, in culture, and that it is the responsibility and the opportunity for white Western people from the global north to save, rescue, civilize, or democratize Black, Brown, Native, and Asian peoples worldwide, domestically and globally. This is the logic of ableism operating at civilizational scale. And it is tied to the minor, seemingly minor, and intricate ways that from the moment that we are born, we are expected to conform to and assimilate into whiteness, abledness, masculinity, or a particular relationship to masculinity, productivity, and capitalist mode of political economy. Ableism in the United States has wended its way throughout our immigration laws, throughout our domestic property laws, our education laws, Ableism undergirds every aspect of our society. The pandemic is not new. The response to this pandemic is not new. Why are there so many people who will refuse to wear masks when they're perfectly capable of doing so, who come from wealth and privilege and believe that they should not get a vaccine? Because many of those people come from white, wealth privileged communities where they are not seeing their neighbors dying, where they are not seeing their neighbors constantly exposed, where they are not making choices every day that could mean life or death for them and the people they live with. Many of those people have never known what it is like to have to experience the constant specter of death as a shadow overhanging every moment, every breath that you take. Distrust of vaccines and the medical establishment that comes out of marginalized, negatively racialized communities comes from a very different place. And that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is people who come from racial and from class privilege, who believe that because they do not understand how this may affect them, that those whom it does affect, Black, brown, impoverished, and disabled people, are expendable, do not matter, do not register as persons in the same way as their own kind do. But ableism and racism show up also in the ways in which we attend to or fail to attend to disability, in recognizing, in naming, and acknowledging disability. Because of the way that ableism and racism operate in tandem, making disability both hypervisible and deliberately rendered invisible within negatively racialized communities, we will often fail to recognize or to name disabilities that arise as a result of war, of colonialism, of environmental racism, of deprivation, of incarceration and surveillance and criminalization, of sexual violence. We do not generally recognize in the same category of disability because we define both ableness and disabledness with whiteness, disabilities like developmental disabilities caused by lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, a largely Black community. We do not recognize or name as disabilities like autoimmune conditions and cancers that are caused by fracking and pipeline spillages in impoverished Black and Native communities and rural communities. We do not name or recognize as disabilities asthma, autoimmune conditions, and learning disabilities that are caused and exacerbated by air pollution, by unsafe and uninhabitable living conditions in public housing units that are primarily occupied by impoverished Black and brown people in cities, that are infested by insects or rodents, or that have incredible growths of mold or mildew, that are falling apart, that lack infrastructure, that lack sufficient plumbing. We do not recognize or name as disabilities those disabilities, psychological as well as physical and sensory, that are caused by militarization, occupation, and deliberate material aid to authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, whether through support of torture training in the School of the Americas or upholding Israeli military occupation of Palestine, whether it is in disabilities that are caused by nuclear weapons testing in largely rural Native communities in the mainland or in Indigenous Pacific Islander communities, disabilities that were caused by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, disabilities that were caused by napalm in Vietnam, disabilities generationally and intergenerationally, historically and collectively caused by trauma, the trauma of an entire lost generation to the AIDS epidemic, the trauma of genocides in Rwanda, in Eritrea, in Armenia, the trauma of constant coup and war, the trauma of deprivation, of famine, the trauma of family separation because of child protective services, because of incarceration, because of immigration enforcement, the trauma of abuse by parents, by caregivers, by partners, the trauma caused and exacerbated by medical abuse and discrimination, preventing many of us in our marginalized communities from ever feeling comfortable seeking out care, leading to early death, the trauma of early death. of knowing that the commonly cited community known statistic that the average lifespan for a trans person of color, especially for a trans woman who is Black or brown, is only into your 30s. Of knowing that for people who have my particular disability, other autistic people, that we are projected on average to die 3 decades younger than non-autistic people. The second leading cause of our death is suicide. Ableism and racism operate in tandem, down to the ways in which we do and do not recognize and name disability. Who we think of when we think about disability, and who we fail to think of when we think about disability. Whose disabilities become acceptable and tolerable, and whose do not. And I ask us even to think about this, right? Where in the work that I do, I often find myself the only openly disabled person of color, the only openly trans disabled person, the only openly trans disabled person of color in so many spaces that I am in. And yet, I ask often, why am I here? Because I know that I'm a light-skinned person with a graduate degree who speaks fluent, clear English without a speech-related disability. I'm a hearing person, I'm a sighted person, I'm ambulatory. I'm not experiencing psychosis, I do not hear voices. My face has fairly conventional features and shapes and proportions. And if any of those things were different about me, I wonder, would I still be asked to visit as many classrooms as I am? Would I still be asked to show up to as many committee meetings as I am? And we all know the answer to that. I wouldn't. I wouldn't be. And it's not necessarily because all of the people that have ever invited or hosted me are always thinking, let's find the most possibly least disturbing or uncomfortable disabled person possible. That's usually not the case. But it is because ableism is so insidious and racism is so insidious that even when we believe that we are naming, owning, and challenging those ideologies and oppressive structures within our own minds, our own thinking, our own practices, they still show up. If you look at the bigger picture, if you think on the larger macro scale, who are all of the people that we support? Who are all of the people that we invite? Who are the people that are asked to serve on boards of directors? Who are the people that are asked to be featured in an activist visibility campaign? Who are the people that are asked to come to a conference? Who are the people who are asked to give a talk? Who are the people whose work is widely shared and cited? And if we knew everything there was to know about each of the people who are not cited or shared or invited or honored as much as they ought to be, would they be? The friends that I have who've lived for years, sometimes decades, inside institutions, whether disability or penal institutions, the friends and comrades that I have who have speech disabilities, who hear voices, who have been chronically homeless, who have been incarcerated for a long time, who have disabilities that create deeply atypical physical appearances, are rarely, if ever, in the same places. But for when those of us that happen to have relatively or slightly more power, access, or privilege or resources demand that our presence becomes conditioned on the presence and the participation of others in our communities who are not offered that same opportunity. And that too should never have to be the case. But all of us who are here today who have been in those positions, we know and understand that it is. Who is heard and listened to and considered to be a valued voice to be listened to when we talk about COVID policy, vaccine rollout? Not people in my communities. Not the people doing survival sex work. Not the people who are facing their third eviction this year. Not the people who are working 5, 6, or 7 jobs to survive. Not the people who do not know how to speak the language of policy, even though they offer brilliant wisdom every single day. Ableism and racism have always operated in tandem to produce and maintain the supposedly coherent concepts of intelligence, of knowledge production, of authority, of credibility, and of personhood. Last here on this screen, ableism is capitalist and eugenicist. Ableism is profoundly capitalist because it is deeply concerned with defining our value and worth based in our production. And not just our production as an abstract concept, but our production in terms of what it is we are producing, how quickly, how consistently, and how frequently we produce it, the manner or methodology by which we produce it, and to whose benefit and to whose detriment we are producing it. Under racialized capitalism and ableism, our value becomes determined relative to what can be exploited and extracted from us for the benefit of wealth accumulation and empire. Ableism and capitalism operate in tandem as well. And they teach us that no matter where we are, no matter where we go, no matter what conversations we may have, that our humanity and our personhood are always conditional, that we must constantly work to earn personhood. Do you deserve to have enough money to pay rent? Do you deserve to have food? Do you deserve to have working conditions that respect your ability to have access to some form of health or wellness as defined by you? Do you deserve to be respected? Do you deserve to be treated as a peer or a colleague? And this is what I mean when I said earlier that we can work all the time, and we often do, to attempt to understand and apply those concepts to everybody else around us, while nonetheless consistently failing to do so for ourselves. We always fail to apply those concepts to ourselves. We will remind everybody else around us, our colleagues, our friends, that you are not valuable based on our production, that you deserve to rest. And we never apply that in our own lives, ever. Because we are also made to feel guilty for even thinking about the idea that it might ever become okay to rest, to take a break, to say no. Because it has also been so deeply ingrained in us that we have to constantly earn access to literally every form of resource, including those necessary for sustaining life, that even in activist spaces, even in organizing spaces, even in spaces that claim to be thinking critically, that claim to foster radical or even revolutionary thought, we nonetheless place our value based on how many committees we're part of, how many conferences we go to, how many organizations we have joined, how much we have written, how much we have spoken, how many events we have gone to, how many rallies we've planned or attended, how many protests we have been part of, how many tasks we take on. We define our worth and our value based on what we do, how much of it we do, and we praise people for it. Over the last couple of years, I've begun to wonder about what I should ask people to say when they introduce me, when I'm speaking to a group too. Because it is both true, right, that as a disabled person of color, it is so much more likely that my accomplishments and work will be diminished or erased when compared to colleagues who are white, abled, and wealth privileged, who will be lauded for the smallest of accomplishments, that I deserve to have my accomplishments and my work recognized. And it is true that in naming me as someone worth listening to, giving time to, giving space to, because of this set of accomplishments, work that I'm doing, projects that I'm taking on, will reinforce the notion that I only deserve to be respected because of work that I am doing, because of what I do. That's why I should be respected, that's why people should think highly of me. And what does that say about and for all of our friends, comrades, colleagues, and community members who are not producing or working at the same pace, in the same way, the same amount, or at all. The one thing that struck me last spring in the semester, in March, the 1 to 2 week period when the entire country just abruptly shut down in a panic, while also believing that it would all be over in no more than 8 weeks or so, which is laughable, especially retrospectively. What I remember most was hearing from across the country, from friends and colleagues everywhere, students, teachers, K-12, higher education, no matter where they were, talking about how there was an expectation that we needed to keep things operating as close to normal as possible, just online, so that we didn't kill each other, but still doing things at the same pace, still doing the same type of work, still doing the same amount of work. And this was true in some ways very obviously and very clearly in the education context. It was also true in activism and organizing. We're still going to hold this conference. We're still going to find a way to organize this protest. We're still going to do it. And some of that was born of necessity. This is rage that cannot be contained, that we must express. But a lot of it came out of an adherence to and investment in mythologies of capital, of self-sufficiency, of intelligence. I heard from my students that they had professors who were suddenly devising more assignments, more lab reports, more reading reflections, more quizzes, mandating attendance at synchronous sessions, without regard to, of course, the realities that people didn't always have a safe place to go, couldn't afford internet, didn't have a device, didn't have somewhere private or quiet or even clean that they felt comfortable being in, didn't live in the same time zone as the instructor. And forget all of those things, there was this expectation you had to be there in order to prove even more, to overcompensate for not being in person. Because in this country, we also negatively racialize and class code online education as something that impoverished Black and brown people, and especially immigrants of color, do, and not something that is truly academic or rigorous or scholarly in the same way as a conventional or traditional on-campus education. And so to move online meant that so many faculty and universities felt a need to overcompensate for that perceived racial and class negative coding of online learning, to say we will prove that our courses are truly rigorous, truly scholarly, by piling on more work, more expectations, stricter timelines and deadlines, more intensive assignments, just so we can prove we really are learning. Universities also began to adopt in much more widespread usage virtual proctoring software that recreates surveillance mechanisms in students' own homes and living spaces by presumptively assuming that students are liars, cheaters, or frauds who must be surveilled in order to respect the sanctity of the academic exam process. Softwares that disproportionately are likely to single out and discriminate against Black students, brown students, disabled students, trans students, anyone who is living in a situation or inhabiting a body mind that is not conformed to white, abled, wealth-privileged norms and expectations. Universities expected students to be able to be fine, talk about mental health for a day, and then go back to being fine. Universities expected faculty and staff to be fine, and told many staff, and increasingly are now telling many faculty as well, you still have to come here anyway. Sure, we know people are dying from this deadly pandemic disease that is transmitted through the air, but come back here anyway, because we need to prove that we're still operating like normal and things are fine. We are all that dog in the cartoon sitting there with the room on fire, breathing in the smoke and the fumes and the ashes, about to die by suffocation, by smoke inhalation, or by heat, who knows, saying, this is fine, it's not fine. Spoiler alert, none of this is fine. And the way we were doing things before was not fine. There is no going back to before, but even if there were, why would we want to? It was already unsustainable and inhumane. Our healthcare system was already a racist, ableist system that does not provide care and does not care about health. Our legal system was already doing exactly what it was designed to do: to control, to contain, to incarcerate. I deeply appreciate the person who just switched their background to the dog on fire cartoon. The only humane thing for universities to have done, had they done it, but not one was courageous enough or imaginative enough to consider doing it, would have been to immediately suspend all classes, exams, papers, to commit to paying full wages and salaries and benefits for staff and faculty, at least anyone who was not making six figures. We could have stood to cut a lot of salary pay from university presidents and certain deans, and I have a lot of feelings about this. And to make sure that the university would have crafted a plan to protect students' access to financial aid, to protect students' access to continued scholarship money in the event that the delay before returning to instruction at another point might have changed graduation dates or graduation plans, that students would earn at least partial credit for courses taken during that spring semester, and that students who did not have a safe or stable place to get to would have somewhere relatively safer to stay while helping pay for other students to go home. Those would have been the only humane steps for universities to consider moving toward. But none of them did. Because instead, we've all internalized the ableist mythologies that we have to perform, and we have to prove our intelligence, and we have to earn personhood and access to life-sustaining resources. Disability justice, in contrast to the violence of ableism, teaches us that our liberation lies in our interdependence, in intergenerational, cross-community, cross-movement building and solidarity, in creating networks and communities and collectives of care, of support, of organizing, of resistance, of crafting alternate ways of living with one another in relationship to ourselves, to our communities, to the land we live on. That our interdependence is a necessary prerequisite and precondition to achieving our collective liberation. The image that appears on this screen is a black and white photograph of a Black woman with a small afro and glasses speaking outward and away from the camera. This is a picture of Audre Lorde. The text says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." Audre Lorde, famed queer Black feminist, thinker, scholar, activist, was also disabled. And she knew, and she taught us, that our work can never be caught up in believing or focusing that we can understand it or expand it only by thinking about one issue, one community, one mode of identity. Because our communities, our movements, our identities, our histories are intricately interrelated and interconnected. Ableism and racism are both necessary for and dependent upon one another. Capitalism and white supremacy operate in tandem. The US empire abroad is predicated upon settler colonialism at home. We do not exist in a silo. Our struggles are connected. Disability justice teaches this. It also teaches us, though, that our struggles are not the same, and we must not mistake solidarity for erasure. This is a photograph of Leela Watson, who comes from an indigenous nation within the country known as Australia. She is an elder with silver hair and glasses, smiling warmly in invitation. The quote says, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." I don't know if, when, or whether we will come out on another side of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. I don't know if this will be like the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which more or less disappeared after a couple of years, although there was no cure ever invented, horrifyingly. Nor do I know if it will be like the Black Plague of the Middle Ages, where for about a century or so, there were intermittent experiences of plague. There would be plague years and then years of no plague, and then plague years again, and then years of no plague. I don't know. I really hope it's not that. Especially as a person with health-related OCD, I especially hope it is not that. But I don't know. What I do know is this crisis did not throw all of us into new crisis. For many of us, it exacerbated and sharpened existing crisis. It added new layers to existing crisis. But for many of us at the margins of the margins, we have always already been in crisis. Crisis is ordinary. Crisis is normal. Crisis is default. I do not know what it is like to live outside of that modality. I would like to. What I know is that no matter what happens politically, pandemic related, in our schools, in our families, we must keep organizing. We have no other option. I told people this consistently and constantly during the election season. And people would ask me what I thought was going to happen, who I thought I would win, if I cared who I was voting for, if I had a strong opinion about it. And like many other organizers have taught us before me and will continue teaching after me, we have to organize no matter what. That is what we do. It doesn't matter who holds political power. It doesn't matter what environmental crises we face, we must keep organizing. Disability justice is not an abstract set of concepts or ideas. Disability justice is an imperative for our future. Disability justice is a vision. Disability justice offers us a way to imagine futures where mass death, where mass criminalization, where mass violence are unthinkable and unimaginable. Disability justice asks us to imagine a future and what that future might feel like, where those things that you all shared, feeling exhausted, annoyed, tired, wanting to feel hope, right? Where that's not part of our lexicon anymore, because our lexicon is instead centered on care and access and support and love. Disability justice offers us to consider what it would feel like to be able to experience complete, whole justice. What it would feel like to be able to taste freedom. What it would feel like to be in right relation with ourselves, with our communities, with our land. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just switching my speaker. Thank you so much for speaking to all of that, Lydia. I feel a little bit overwhelmed by a lot of that, and I'm still processing through a lot of what you were talking about. In the interest of just allowing one question to come through, there was a question that was really resonated with what you were speaking about with the education system and just pushing on because everything is fine. And this person asked to reflect on how to change our focus right now instead of continuing these inhumane work and education practices. How do we switch it up, push, raise the flag, refuse to continue to participate in these practices? And I think another important caveat to this question is, as a person who is not tenured versus a person who is, and a person who faces multiple marginalizations within the academy versus those who don't face that. So what would you say to that question?
This is Lydia. Um, I am eating some of the very cinnamony coffee cake that I made the other day, gluten-free. The bacon, I cook everything from scratch. Very proud of that. And I occupy a tenuous and somewhat marginal space in academic communities. I teach as an adjunct, and I'm a multiply marginalized person who is not representative of the majority of people who are in teaching positions, and especially those who have more secure positions, generally do not look like me, generally do not share my identities or experiences. And that being said, I often choose to resist those expectations and norms in ways that might not feel safe or comfortable or possible for other people in a similar position as me. But sometimes they are. And for me, those questions are always ones about imagination and imaginative capacity. So for example, just now, right? Like thinking, sure, I'm in this session and I'm leading a talk and I'm going to eat anyway. I'm not going to chew with my mouth open because that's just gross, but I'm going to eat anyway. And we can all wait the extra 30 seconds while I do that. And I invite my students to do the same. I got a lot of questions from students this semester saying like, so like where I'm living, it's kind of dinner time and like your class is a few hours long. Is it okay to eat in your class? My syllabus explicitly says you can eat. Please eat your food. Please eat a whole meal. You can do it on camera or off camera. I really don't care. Like, because we have bodily needs. So there are ways for us, right, to attend to and disrupt expectations for how we learn, how we exist or behave or comport ourselves in academic space that don't necessarily run the risk of getting us into deep trouble. There was some concerning noises outside my window. We'll deal with that later. Hopefully that was just like some large icicle breaking off. Okay. Roommate yelled from other room, it was snow. Let's just go with that.
Yeah.
So there are ways to do that, right? Like I invite my students to make their own time. I invite my students to design their own way of learning in my courses. And I do that as a way of inviting them to co-design their learning process and also to take ownership over their own pedagogical development and over their own learning, over their own curriculum and over their own relationship to me and to the class that they are in. And then there are things that I do that might risk perhaps some scrutiny that perhaps is not great and that other people may not want to risk. For example, I have a policy on extensions, which is there aren't really any deadlines in my class. It's due when you give it to me. That's the due date. And if students, because of their particular disabilities, really need and crave structure, I offer suggested due dates. Here are suggested due dates if you want to try to divide the work according to a structure, but they're not actually enforced due dates. There is no such thing as late work for me. And in one course that I taught a few years ago, I also apply the same policy to taking an incomplete. I approve literally any request for an incomplete, and I never require documentation or even just an explanation. I don't require a student to tell me why they want an incomplete. I just ask them to say, do you want one? If so, I will fill out the paperwork, and then you can have until the university will come after you for not doing the work. Because I believe that people move at different paces and in different ways. And sometimes that means doing work on a completely different timeline than the artificially constructed semester. But there's other things that I've done too in the pandemic. For example, in the pandemic, I adopted a proposal that students at Georgetown University had created last year that they asked the university to enact across the entire university, which the university declined to do, but I adopted it for my class. It was called the double A policy. And the rationale behind it is that even if individual instructors wish to be compassionate and supportive, there are graduate school programs, fellowships, and scholarships that have GPA and grade requirements. There are in major requirements and in minor requirements for grades and GPA. Employers may look at a student's transcript and hold their grades against them or not. And so even if I don't really care about grades and don't believe they matter, a lot of other people who might materially affect a student's life do care. about those grades. And so the double A policy means that all students received either an A or an A minus, which allowed for some differentiation in the sense of, did you show up and were you enrolled in this course, you get the lower grade, versus did you go above and beyond and do extra work because you wanted to and felt like it, then you get the higher grade. But either way, it shows up as a grade that is higher so that you're not basically being penalized for living through a fucking pandemic and being forced to be in classes anyway. Because ideally, we shouldn't have to give those kinds of grades that try to quantify or quasi-quantify students' achievement or their work. But if we are forced to do so, that's at least one way to both recognize the real world consequences outside of an individual class of grades and GPA in students' lives, to prove to the university, no, really, I am giving some differentiation. I'm not just giving everyone the same grade, but also to take a lot of pressure off of students too, to say, like, you don't have to actually try to outperform in this class. Like, if you show up once in a while and turn in something eventually, ever, you'll get an A minus. And if you actually complete all the assignments as and contemplated on the original syllabus, then you can get the A. And there's other specific tactics and pedagogical methods that I've adopted in my own teaching over the last several years that I use to try to create spaces that are more welcoming, that encourage multimodality. But that's like a whole separate conversation. I actually do trainings for a lot of faculty on curricular and pedagogical design that more universities should frankly pay me to do because they need it. But of course, the attendance will probably be self-selected, and the faculty that most need the information will probably never show up. So that's a separate problem. But really, what I suppose I would say, just in a sort of a larger macro response to the question that you posed, is that it really comes down to taking back control and ownership of the space you are in. Because for most of us, even if we're multiply marginalized, there isn't someone sitting in on every single one of our course sessions. There isn't somebody overlooking our shoulder for every little thing that we email students or post to a course management site, even if we might have to get certain things approved, even if we get observed some of the time. Like, someone else just does not have the time or the energy or the desire to look over literally everything that we are doing. And so for me, it is a matter of being explicit and clear about my aims in the classroom. I don't hide that information from my students. I tell them these are my aims pedagogically. And I also tell them, when I model for them, asking for support around my own access needs. Asking students, for example, if you don't feel comfortable being on camera, that's totally fine, but could you please upload a photo of something, preferably you, but it could be something else, so that I'm not staring at black squares when I'm talking to you, because that's weird to stare at black squares. I asked students in person classes, when classes were meeting in person, to always have a name card in front of them, because I'm face blind and I don't want to embarrass myself by never knowing who anybody is by the time it's May. So I say, these are my access needs. This is why I need this. This is why I'm asking you to do this. And that's a way of modeling for students what they can do. And they may not all feel comfortable doing so because of their own experiences, because of their own traumas, because of their own rightful distrust. But it's a way of modeling and establishing the kind of classroom space that I want to have and taking back control. Who said that you have to require students to do a paper according to certain parameters? Why not allow them to do it as a series of connected papers on a related theme? Who says that you have to give students an exam on paper and in writing? Why does it have to be timed? Could it be an oral examination? Could it be a conversation? Could it be something that the student records on their own? Could it be something that students do collaboratively versus on their own, or not, never collaboratively? Like, what are all of the opportunities for enabling students to learn and to apply their own knowledge? And we'll find that most of the time, we don't have to use conventional modalities just because we're expected to, and that's the way it's always been done before. And many of those modalities may not even be effective at helping students to learn, especially virtually, or helpful at all in assessing what students have learned in your class either. And that's really what it comes down to for me, is whether you have a lot more privilege or you experience a lot more marginalization, at the individual level, how can we reimagine and take back ownership of our own classroom spaces? And if you do have more privilege and power, how can you leverage that power to tell the university, here's what I'm doing, and we need to adopt these policies more universally. We need to adopt totally different grading policies. We need to adopt a completely different way of assessing for academic dishonesty that doesn't involve surveilling students and preemptively criminalizing them, right? So you are in that position where you can raise those concerns.
I love the like thinking of creatively and also thinking like we have a lot of space to do things if we realize that we're not necessarily being watched all the time. And that is all I will say about that. So I want to honor everyone's time. It is 1:30. So if you are ready to go to your next class or go somewhere else, that would be really awesome. Our lovely and Kate reminding us that we do have an evaluation. If you could so kindly fill out that for our funding purposes, that would be lovely. The link is in the chat. So thank you for attending this.